In the name of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, one God. Amen. One of my favorite things about being an Episcopalian is that, maybe you don't share this, is that our celebration of All Saints' Day is so expansive. It's one of those places where the Episcopal Church has settled squarely between the Roman Catholic tradition of venerating the saints and the very Protestant traditions of passively acknowledging or completely neglecting the very notion of sainthood. Our church doesn't limit this great cloud of witnesses to just those whose sainthood has been decided by the church for their martyrdom or virginity, or because they've had some arbitrary number of miracles attributed to their intercession. But our church recognizes the saintliness of everyday people, people whose lives are so remarkable that by their very living, they model to us what it means to be a saint. Their lives demonstrate to us the road we might follow in faith and good works to achieve a holy and godly life. In many ways, the Beatitudes, those blessed statements found in today's gospel lesson, mark out a similar way of being honored as saints, one that isn't focused on doing things, but ways of being that ground us in our humanity. Things like being poor in spirit and mourning, or those who hunger and thirst for justice, who work for peace, or who show mercy to others. While these aren't prescriptive teachings that say, do this and you will be blessed, they instead pattern for us the things that are fundamental to living a life that follows the teachings of Christ. The Beatitudes tell us that to be blessed by God, we should work for peace. We should mourn for the world around us. And perhaps the more complicated one, we should be open to being insulted and ridiculed by others, because that's how we know we're doing it right. That's how we know we're following the plan. Before we get to chapter 5, Matthew's gospel tells us that Jesus has been traveling all throughout Galilee, teaching in synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and sickness among the people. And great crowds followed him, coming from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan in Syria. People from all over the place had heard of the things he's been doing, and they wanted to know more. They desired to be close to him and understand his teachings, because they were the people who he would call blessed, the mourners and the merciful, people from across all of Palestine and Syria had gathered together to learn from this teacher who was healing and blessing people. And so I'm struck by where this text takes place, because everything we know about Jewish tradition during Jesus' timeline tells us that all that Jesus was doing had a designated place where it should be done, in the temple. As a teacher and healer, Jesus should have been in the temple in Jerusalem, where the deserving people, the powerful people, could find and hear what he had to say. But is that where we find him? Where he's supposed to be? No, he's gone up the side of a mountain. Get on your hiking boots. He's out in the wilderness, out where the people who need his healing most would be found. He's not seeking out the people sitting in the marble halls of the temple complex or the wealthy Romans in the heart of the city, but the people who, both literally and metaphorically, are out on the margins. And generally, though not exclusively, those are the people whose stories we find in our litany of saints. They're the people who had to push back against the powers of empire and institutions to remind the church what its role in the world is, to remind the church that to be followers of Jesus, we have to be people for whom the Beatitudes apply. We have to mourn. We have to be meek. We have to work for peace. These saints are the people whose stories can inspire within us a new way of being a person who claims to follow Jesus. The invocation of the Holy Ones of God that we started the service with is a great lesson in church history. I admitted to someone recently, was it Angela, that I didn't do as well in church history in seminary as some of my other courses. Was it you? It was you. But there's one thing about church history that does interest me, and it's the history of our saints. And not just those saints that the Catholic Church has beatified, but the names of all of those who we remember on days like today. The names found in the invocation, and there are many. The names that we don't know. They're all saints whose lives modeled the values of the gospel, those who have effected some positive change for both the church and the world. The saints that we knew personally and loved. They're names that prove that Jesus' teachings are just as potent outside the walls of the temple, just as potent without the permission of the decision makers and policy writers of history. Maybe we recognize some of those names, I'm sure. But I know some saints on that list are unfamiliar. Perhaps you don't know who Paul Cuffey, Edith Stein, or Perpetua and Felicity are. But I think you should. I think you should know their stories and learn and understand what made them tick, what drove them to live so passionately for the gospel that they changed the world, even in a tiny way. The good thing about a worship bulletin is that you can take it home and ponder the service throughout the week. And yet every week I put a big stack of them in the recycling. I mean it, take them home. Stick them in your bags and your pockets and take them home. Read them again, especially this week. Take that damn bulletin home. Google Google some of those names and learn about who sits at our banquet table of saints. But more seriously, how can we mean to become one of those saints of God if we don't know their stories? If we don't know how they lived, how can we shape our lives to look like theirs? It's important for us to learn what it was about George Fox's aversion to steeplehouses that drew him to patterning his life how he did, or what it was about Fanny Crosby's life that led her to write thousands and thousands of hymns, some of which appear in our hymn books. What was it about them? Our unique Episcopalian ideas around sainthood mean that each one of us, because of how we advance God's kingdom on earth, is a saint. And there's no reason why we shouldn't live our lives like that each day, to go through the world thinking to ourselves, for the saints of God are just folk like me, and I mean to be one too.